New Mexico's history is one full of conflict and resistance to interlopers. A story that has blended multiple cultures into a proud and unique American mix that remains lively to this day. To see why, join me for this brief look at the history and politics of New Mexico. Anthropologists believe that New Mexico's earliest inhabitants arrived in the area some 25,000 years ago, but the clearest evidence of human habitation from this period comes from the much more recent Clovis culture from some 11,000 years ago. A group of hunter-gatherers who were then followed by the Folsom people sometime around 9000 BCE. In the following millennia, as the region became hotter and drier, new groups arrived and the Clovis and Folsom moved on to better pastures. The new arrivals discovered agriculture around 3,500 years ago, creating a lifestyle that depended heavily on corn and squash. During this period, the future state had among its inhabitants the Mogollons, who settled near the modern Arizona border, eventually building villages, and the ancestral Pueblo Indians, sometimes called Anasazis, who lived in the Four Corners, where modern Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah meet, and created one of the most developed civilizations of the time. Starting around 850 CE, ancestral pueblos began to construct towns in Chaco Canyon, in what is now northwestern New Mexico. These were large structures made out of stone and adobe that could have as many as hundreds of rooms, including large round ones, used for religious ceremonies and other community gatherings called kivas. Built partially underground and accessed via stairs, they were meant to represent the idea of humans emerging out of the earth. By around 1100, the Chaco Canyon settlement had somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 people. Their lifestyle changed around 1300, however, when a long dry spell made it more difficult to grow crops and thus encouraged them to find new places to settle. This in turn led ancestral pueblos to divide themselves into distinct groups, which by the beginning of the 16th century included the Hopi, Zuni, Pecos, Tano, Jemez, and so on. Around this time, other indigenous groups of people also arrived in the area, including the Navajo and Apache, followed by the Utes and Comanches. The newcomers began to dispute the ancestral pueblos' control of the area, especially the Navajos and Apaches, who would at times raid the pueblo towns for food. The biggest challenge by far, however, was just over the horizon: the appearance of Europeans. The first non-natives to arrive in the future state may have been survivors of the Pánfilo Narváez expedition in 1527, a group that included their leader, Álvaro Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, and Estevanico, an enslaved African who was the first person of African descent to explore North America. We do not know for sure because Cabeza de Vaca and company wandered through the southwest and northern Mexico as medicine men without precise maps. What is clear, however, is that this group prompted the first Spanish expedition to the area, as Estevanico's stories of Cibola, one of the fabled 7 cities of gold, a place he had supposedly heard about from the natives, convinced the Viceroy of New Spain in Mexico City, Antonio de Mendoza, to send an expedition north in 1537. The search party was headed by Marcos de Niza, a Franciscan friar, and had Estevanico as the mission's advance scout. Unfortunately for both, the trip did not turn out so well for them, as the latter was killed at the hands of the natives and the former would eventually be accused of lying about what he had found in his trip and stripped of his authority. However, de Niza's reports of a discovery of a town bigger than Mexico City prompted a larger expedition in 1540, this time headed by Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, the governor of New Galicia. This new excursion followed a northern route through Sonora and Arizona and crisscrossed the future state from west to east, starting with the settlement, now ruins, of Jawiku. The natives were friendly to the Spaniards at first, and one of them, a man known to the Spanish as Bigotes or Mustache, even served as a guide for the expedition. Conflict over resources, however, soon turned into violence, and in December 1540, the first named war between the natives and Europeans, the Tiguex War, occurred. A skirmish the Spanish won. Hostility, however, prevented the creation of any settlements, and Coronado opted to withdraw back to Mexico in April 1542. The Spaniards would not return for another 39 years, but in the meantime, the Europeans began calling the area to the north New Mexico. The person that brought the Spanish back was Juan de Oñate, a wealthy merchant and mine owner born in Zacatecas, whose stated mission was both to colonize the north and bring Christianity to its peoples. In January 1598, he set out from New Galicia with 400 settlers and soldiers, along with their livestock, and crossed the Rio Grande at El Paso 6 months later. Following the river north on July 22nd of that year, Oñate would found the first Spanish settlement in the future state at San Juan de los Caballeros, today Oque Owingue, a town about 30 miles north of Santa Fe. The Spanish immediately set out to convert the natives and demanded food, clothing, and labor from them, with a good dose of brutality for those who refused. The native peoples responded in two ways: by fleeing to the countryside, and in the case of the Acoma Pueblo, resistance. Intending to make an example out of them, on January 22, 1599, Oñate sent a punitive expedition led by Vicente de Saldívar. The natives were able to withstand the Spanish onslaught for 2 days, but on the third, they fell to the European superior artillery. As a result, around 800 Acomas were killed, including women and children. The survivors were condemned to 20 years of forced labor, except for the children under 12, who were placed in the care of priests. Oñate would then continue his brutal campaign against the locals, including with several expeditions beyond New Mexico. In 1606, however, facing imminent removal as governor, he resigned and returned to Mexico City to face accusations of cruelty to both natives and colonists. He was convicted and banished from New Mexico for life, leaving the incipient colony in limbo. The Franciscan success in baptizing hundreds of Pueblo natives, however, convinced the government in Mexico to prop up the flailing settlements. Meanwhile, thinking that San Juan was vulnerable to native attacks, the new governor, Pedro de Peralta, decided to move the capital in 1610 to its present site in Santa Fe, making this the oldest state capital in the United States. In the following decades, an uneasy truce developed between the colonists and the Pueblo Indians that allowed New Mexico to survive. In exchange for protection from attacks from other natives, like the Apache and Navajo, the Pueblo would live within the mission system and support it with their labor. Spanish abuse continued, however, and when famine struck in the 1670s and the authorities' ability to prevent native raids diminished, the Pueblo had enough and revolted. Violence began on August 10, 1680. Orchestrated by Popey, a Tiwa religious leader who had been imprisoned 5 years earlier along with 47 other leaders accused of witchcraft, it managed to amass around some 2,000 men who quickly raided the Spanish settlements and killed some 400 people, including women and children and 21 of the 33 Franciscan missionaries in New Mexico. The survivors, under the command of Antonio de Termin, barricaded themselves in the palace of the governors in Santa Fe, and once they got some reinforcements, fled to Paso del Norte. The Puebloans followed them, but decided not to attack. Governor Otermin would yet try to recapture New Mexico the following year, but his attempt would fail, and thus the Spanish would be effectively expulsed from the colony for over a decade. This might well have ended Spanish control over the territory forever, but two key developments prevented that. First, Popey's authority diminished, and thus the native alliance weakened, not only because the paradise that Popey had promised did not materialize, but drought continued, and the Apache and Navajo raids increased. This was worsened by Popey's attempt to prohibit the planting of all crops of European origin and the destruction or removal of all Spanish herds and horses, an unpopular move that contributed to his fall from power. Second, Spanish geopolitical considerations intervened. The French had been expanding their footprint across North America in the 17th century, and the Spanish crown was worried they could soon threaten the rich mines of Nueva Vizcaya, so having a buffer colony in New Mexico seemed necessary. Thus, in 1692, Don Diego de Vargas was sent to reconquer the territory, something that ended up being bloodless since the natives were not in a position to offer much of a fight. Instead, resistance was spread over the next few years, including a second organized revolt in 1696, which succeeded in murdering 5 missionaries and 34 settlers, but this one was quickly crushed. The Spanish would never face similar rebellions again. Meanwhile, although their independence was short-lived, the Pueblo Indians did gain substantial land grants from the crown, and most importantly, tolerance for their culture and religion, which allowed it to survive. Peace paved the way for new Spanish settlements, leading to the founding of Bernalillo in 1695, Albuquerque in 1706, Los Lunas in 1716, and Belén in 1740. Growth continued, and by 1752, the province's population reached 3,402 people, which then more than doubled by 1789. One of the Spanish governors during this period, Tomás Vélez Cachupín, had much to do with this newfound resilience, as he was able to work out a truce with some of the roaming tribes, especially the Utes. He did this in part through the opening up of trade with the Plains peoples, which in turn helped boost the province's economy. This also led to the creation of a unique Nuevo Mexicano culture, which you can still see today. Developments elsewhere were about to change this dynamic. First, the American Revolution and subsequent Louisiana Purchase created a direct territorial dispute with the U.S., as the borders of the newly acquired territory were not clearly defined. Zebulon Pike, an American lieutenant tasked with exploring the new purchase, was even arrested by Santa Fe authorities for encroaching on Spanish land in 1807. This was temporarily resolved with the Adams-Onís Treaty in 1819, but then the very political status of the province changed when Agustín de Iturbide declared New Spain independent in 1821, and New Mexico became part of the newly formed Mexican Empire. Rule from Mexico City brought two main developments. The first was opening of trade to the rest of the world, which would lead to the creation of the Santa Fe Trail, a commercial highway first pioneered by William Becknell, which would connect New Mexico to American markets. The second was a de facto autonomy that resulted from Mexico's lack of capacity to impose new laws in the province. This was generally welcomed, especially as Governor Manuel Armijo allowed more granting of land to the rich Nuevo Mexicanos. But it also meant that when the Mexican government tried to impose control and raise new taxes, especially in the face of the Texas Revolution in 1836, it faced a rebellion in New Mexico as well. The revolt in question began in 1837 in the Rio Arriba village of Santa Cruz de la Cañada and soon amassed 1,000 angry residents. Governor Albino Perez tried to put down the insurgency, but instead found himself executed. The rebels, under the leadership of the Taos Indian Juan Gonzalez, floated a plan to have foreigners join their movement and annex New Mexico to the U.S. This lost in popularity, and in January 1838, former Governor Armijo crushed the rebellion and had his leaders, including Gonzalez, executed. Tensions continued to run high, with rumors about U.S. annexation and border disputes with the Texas Republic, however. Indeed, the Texans even sent an expedition in 1841, which was officially aimed at opening up commerce with Santa Fe, but in reality intended to convince the New Mexicans to join the Texas Republic by force if necessary. Although the expedition was a complete failure, it accelerated the annexation of Texas by the United States, which in turn prompted the U.S.-Mexico War in April of 1846. That conflict resulted in much death and destruction in Mexico, but less so in New Mexico, where in August 1846, General Stephen W. Kearny was able to occupy Santa Fe without firing a shot. Not that all New Mexicans were thrilled with the new situation. Kearny continued on to California and left a few troops and Charles Bent in charge as the provisional governor of New Mexico, which the locals took as an opportunity to rebel. The fight against the American occupation began in Taos on the morning of January 19, 1847. Led by Pablo Montoya and Tomás Romero, they managed to kill Bent along with several other government officials. The U.S. sent new troops, and by February the insurgents were forced to hold up in a Taos church with thick walls. They could do little against American cannons, however, and the rebellion was quashed. Meanwhile, the U.S.-Mexico War itself would come to an end in May 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ceded New Mexico along with much of the Southwest to the United States. The treaty explicitly protected the rights of Mexican citizens in these lands, but American recognition was not always forthcoming. Indeed, New Mexico, which was the erstwhile Mexican province with the largest population, faced such prejudice that it was prevented from becoming a state for over 62 years. The longest period of any region in the contiguous United States. Instead, it was organized as a territory with shifting boundaries that included various parts of the modern state of Arizona, and then its southern tip when the U.S. annexed the Gadsden Purchase in 1853. The American acquisition brought not just new settlers, but the founding of entirely new towns like Las Cruces in 1849. By 1860, New Mexico's total population was 93,516. Out of these, only 85 were African Americans. Although there were few enslaved people in the territory, New Mexico's legal framework granted few rights to the black population. Thus, not surprisingly, when slavery sparked the start of the Civil War in 1861, New Mexicans were divided over who to support. As a result, both Confederate and Union governments claimed ownership over the territory, and several important battles took place in the area, including a decisive victory for the Union at the Battle of Glorieta Pass in March 1862. Once the Confederate troops were removed, the U.S. military moved on to pacify the Navajo and Apache people. The man tasked for the job was Taos resident Kit Carson, a frontiersman famous for his outdoor skills and exaggerated tales and dime novels. His strategy, which included destroying their crops and livestock, succeeded in rounding up the native peoples onto reservations. In particular, the Navajos in 1864 were forcibly removed in what came to be known as the Long Walk, from the traditional lands to the Pecos Valley in eastern New Mexico, a trek where at least 200 natives died. In the decades after the Civil War, ranching and mining became the mainstay of New Mexico's economy, which in turn benefited from the introduction of the railroad. This led to the founding of yet more towns, including Silver City in 1870, Gallup in 1881, Carlsbad in 1888, and Alamogordo in 1898. It also brought about the creation of the two main state universities, the University of New Mexico and New Mexico State in 1888, although with different names. Men seeking quick riches were attracted to the area, which in turn led to competition and conflict, and sometimes violence. Its most famous example is probably the Lincoln County War, a rivalry full of gunfights, revenge killings, and the assassination of Billy the Kid on July 14, 1881, a story told and retold in novels and westerns such as Young Guns 2. Sometimes the newcomers were also able to use the legal system to dispossess Nuevo Mexicanos of their communal land, as the latter could not present property titles in English, but only in Spanish, which of course created an opposition of its own. Most notably, that of Las Gorras Blancas, or Whitecaps, a group of men who would go around in the 1890s tearing down fences, scattering livestock, and burning barns and haystacks. Eventually, their efforts turned to the creation of a political party, El Partido del Pueblo Unido, but its success was limited. Indeed, as white immigration limited the power of the Nuevo Mexicanos, the American government was at last convinced to grant New Mexico statehood, and it finally became part of the Union on January 6, 1912. Meanwhile, in Mexico, a revolution had exploded in 1910. This had a number of social and economic repercussions for the state, but the most direct consequence was an attack New Mexico suffered at the hands of Pancho Villa on March 9, 1916. On that day, the Villistas burned down the town and fought against the 13th Cavalry, which was stationed there, only then to go back across the border. It was the first and only time the continental U.S. has suffered an attack by a foreign military, and it was the last time the American cavalry was used in battle. As it happens, this was part of Villa's insane plan to get the U.S. to invade Mexico so as to bring down the Mexican government. The former did happen with a punitive expedition commanded by John Pershing, but the latter did not, of course. In the following decades, as the state continued to grow, New Mexicans developed a unique cultural citizenship, a patriotic embracement of Americanness while being proud of their Spanish heritage. This was especially so with regard to the armed forces, where a disproportionate number of New Mexico men served, starting with the Spanish War and continuing with World War I and World War II. In the latter, for example, it would provide the most volunteers and suffer the most casualties of any state. New Mexico's most famous contribution to the World II effort, however, was its allocation for the development of the first nuclear bomb. The state's relative remoteness and sparse population proved ideal for scientific laboratories and top-secret testing of weapons. Los Alamos, for example, a national laboratory that would become one of the largest and most advanced scientific institutions in the world, was established here because it was simultaneously an isolated spot and with easy access to Santa Fe. The war would leave a huge mark in the state beyond this and the veterans it produced. Government investment precipitated an unprecedented economic and demographic boom, with the state's pre-war population of 530,000 nearly doubling to 950,000 by 1960. New Mexico's largely agrarian pre-war economy became more industrialized, and its mostly rural population became increasingly urban. Likewise, as the civil rights movement dominated American politics after World War II, New Mexican leaders also became involved in the struggle. There were folks like Miguel Trujillo who became instrumental in enfranchising Native Americans who had been previously prohibited from voting. More radical voices like Reyes Tijerina, who tried to restore New Mexican land grants to the descendants of Mexican and Spanish owners, and women like Maria Varela, who worked with various cooperatives that helped Mexican American and indigenous communities. Given its population makeup, the state also became a leader in pathbreakers for Latino and indigenous communities. It elected Dennis Chavez in 1935, for example, the first Latino senator to be elected to a full term. Bill Richardson as governor in 2002, the first Latino to run for the presidential Democratic nomination. Susana Martinez in 2010, the first Latina to be governor in the U.S., and Deb Haaland in 2019, the first Native person to serve in a presidential cabinet. During this period, New Mexico also became an art center and a tourist destination. Ernest Blumenschein had founded the Taos Society of Artists as early as 1915, but the permanent move from Georgia O'Keeffe to New Mexico in 1949 brought national attention to the state, especially as her work was very much inspired by her new environment, attracting even more artists and photographers to make the state their new home. Meanwhile, Route 66 and later the interstate highway system made it easy for visitors to come see for themselves New Mexico's beautiful rugged geography. Today, tourism accounts for nearly 9% of all jobs in the state. Nonetheless, despite sustained economic growth, the state remains one of the poorest in the country, ranking 43rd nationally in GDP per capita. Today, this accounts for the state's main problems, along with environmental issues related to drought and water rights, as well as poor quality in its public schools. How New Mexico can improve on all those counts is the challenge of the future.